His research focus has been on EU-Russia relations and global international theory, I would say. And I hope today's talk will be a win-win situation. Because we hope that you will learn something from hearing what Ian has to say, and Ian in turn hopefully will learn something from your questions. Because as I understand, the basis for this talk is a draft of the paper which will be forthcoming sometime, somewhere. So we'll really appreciate your questions since those might help to shape up the forthcoming paper. Without further ado, Ian, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I've got two mics here. Try this one. Hello?
Yeah. That's fine.
I really want one of those Madonna ones, the blonde ambition to be sort of strutting around. Anyway, thank you, Evgeny, for those kind words of introduction. And before I begin, I just want to say how grateful I am to have this opportunity to speak here, but also to work here. Many of my students are in this room. We're a wonderful bunch. Genuinely has been one of the best teaching experiences I've had. So I am very grateful for being here. And what I want to talk about today is something that's not far from the headlines. It's a subject that's attracted a significant amount of attention from policy analysts and from academics like myself. It's a subject that a lot of people have some very strong opinions about. And it's always a challenge when talking about a subject of this kind, which many people are so passionate about. The challenge is to say something that really rises above the sound and the fury of what Plato called doxa, which is the passionate views of opinion makers. Now, according to Plato, overcoming an obsession with doxa is key to overcoming disorder and crisis in politics. Now, few would doubt that today the EU and Russia's relationship and Russia's relations with the West more broadly are in a condition of crisis. Many commentators on the conflict in Ukraine in particular have spoken about this moment as a dawn of a new world disorder. And it's easy to get swept up in the drama of all of this rhetoric. And this lecture is an attempt to take a step back to reflect in a new way on what has gone wrong in the EU-Russia relationship. And this lecture is about the origins of the present crisis and disorder on the wing of contemporary Europe. And it is finally, in final analysis, about what, if anything, can be done to de-escalate the current geopolitical tensions. So the lecture will be in three. Yes, that's right. Yes, the lecture will be in three main parts. Part one is about what I'm calling the geopolitics of cooperation and conflict between the EU and Russia. One of the striking things about the recent analysis of international affairs is the degree of surprise that many express about the fact that geopolitics seems to be back on the agenda. The end of the Cold War in Europe was supposed to be a moment when geopolitics, in particular the geopolitics that divided East from West, had come to a close. So the return of something similar in the last few years has led many to talk about, I'm sure you've all heard about this, the talk of a new Cold War. According to my analysis, the analysis you're about to hear today, this is a very mistaken and alarmist interpretation of what is happening and what's gone wrong. The crisis between the borders of the EU and Russia is a product and a problem of a contemporary geopolitical development. There is no carryover from the Cold War past. There's nothing from prior to 1990 that has implications for the present day. This crisis that I'm going to talk about today belongs entirely to the post-Cold War era, and especially to the period from 2003 to the present. Now, if there are historical analogies or parallels to make, it is not with the Cold War era, but with the late 19th century and early 20th century. And that brings me to part 2 of my talk. Spheres of influence are a practice of great power politics that originates at the end of the 19th century. The first time the phrase sphere of influence was ever used was in a bilateral agreement concluded between Britain and Germany in 1885. This agreement separated and defined the respective spheres of control and territories on the Gulf of Guinea and West Africa. By its provisions, Britain agreed not to grab territory, not to accept protectorates, not to interfere with the extension of German influence in that part of Guinea lying east of a specified line. Germany undertook a reciprocal commitment regarding Britain and the territory west of this line. As the terms of this treaty indicated, it is possible for a great power to intervene in territories within a sphere of influence only when that sphere is applied in a very broad and regional sense. Now, from 1885 to the outbreak of the First World War, there were many agreements between the major powers of the day that recognised spheres of influence in Africa, in the Middle East, and in China. And just to give some bilateral examples from that time, which included Russia, in 1899, an Anglo-Russian agreement greatly strengthened Russia's claim to a sphere of influence in Manchuria, a region of China. In 1907, Britain and Russia signed another treaty. This specified that Afghanistan lay outside of Russia's sphere of influence, meaning, of course, that it lay within Britain's. Persia was divided into 3 zones: a Russian sphere in the north, a British sphere in the south, and a neutral area in between. But without doubt, the most controversial agreement involving spheres of influence that also involved Russia is, of course, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of the 23rd of August 1939, otherwise known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Now, according to a secret protocol that was denied by the Soviet government right up to the very end, this treaty included a protocol that divided the territories of Romania, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Finland into German and Soviet spheres of influence, anticipating the potential, to quote the treaty, territorial and political rearrangements of these countries. And of course, we all know what happened next. Now, in part 3 of my talk, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself. Now, what I refer to in part 2, about the origin of a new Russian sphere of influence in the eastern end of Europe, this is made possible by a treaty-like agreement with the EU. And I'll go into some detail, depending on how much time I have. I'll go into a great deal of detail about this agreement, because most of, if not all of you, will not even be aware of its existence. But let me be quite clear, I'm not suggesting any strong parallels between previous spheres of influence either in Europe or in Asia. I'm not drawing strong parallels between the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and anything that's been agreed between the EU and Russia. Let me just put that to rest right away. The only real parallel that I'm making is one that's referred to in the title of the talk. It's about the connection between cooperation, particularly bilateral cooperation, and the extension of spheres of influence. And to be more specific, it's the bilateral cooperation between major powers that involves, well, what in the Latin is referred to as a fidus, which is in English means a treaty or a pact of political association which formalises the relationship between allies. And the dark side of cooperation is when arrangements like this include possessive claims of a geopolitical nature, and I'll get into those possessive claims of geopolitics in the second and third part of the talk. Now, in part 3, I bring the discussion right up to today, the present day, the negotiations that are currently going on involving policymakers and think tanks in Brussels and in Moscow on the future of the EU-Russia relationship. There's been a dawning realisation over the last 2 years that the strategic partnership between the EU and Russia has failed. The idea of strategic partnership, as I'll hope to explain, has set the framework for the relationship between the EU and Russia from the very end of the Cold War up until very recently, just about a year ago. So my final remarks will be a kind of modest contribution to a conversation that's very much ongoing about what has gone wrong between the EU and Russia, particularly what has gone wrong in their strategic partnership, and how the EU and Russia can avoid making the same mistakes all over again. Now, this is the least funny of the cartoons I'm going to show today. Well, in my estimation, maybe not in yours, but this is an image of taken from The Economist magazine. Now, I don't know if, how many of you regularly read The Economist, but it's got a very anti-Russian slant to it. That's because the Eastern European Russian editor, Edward Lucas, is, for one reason or another, particularly anti-Kremlin. And so be aware that The Economist does take a bit of an anti-Russian slant, and this is a cartoon that's very typical of a depiction of the EU-Russia relationship in The Economist. And what we get is Russia seen in very familiar terms, I'm sure to all of you, as an angry bear. And then you get the European Union in very, quite self-evidently unfamiliar terms, because the cartoonist feels the need to put a briefcase that says the EU on it. Now, the EU here is depicted as Europa, the goddess, the Greek goddess, the moon goddess, I believe she is. And you'll notice she's dropped her suitcase in order to have a tussle with the Russian bear. Now, this, as I say, this is the first of about 3 or 4 visual representations of the EU-Russia uncomfortable kind of cooperation that I'll reveal to you today. And there are, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, there's a bit of a joke involved, but what's the Russian term? Behind the joke, there's a bit of a joke, something like that. There's a kind of, behind every joke, there is a sort of serious intent, and the serious intent here is to kind of get us to think more critically about visual representations that really draw out very strong differences between the EU and Russia. I think by exaggerating the differences, we miss the commonalities. The commonalities are actually much more important in terms of understanding what is going wrong and how mistakes can be avoided in the future. But there are strong, these strong dualities and dichotomies throughout the analysis of the EU-Russia relationship, also in the scholarly analysis, not just in cartoons like this. And the most familiar, sorry, I've got a bit of a cold. The most familiar in the academic literature is the cooperation, is the dichotomy between cooperation and conflict. Now, the LSE, my alma mater, London School of Economics, just a couple of weeks ago, issued a special report. It was all about avoiding a new Cold War. That was the subtitle. And the main thrust of the analysis was that the key to understanding what's going wrong in the EU-Russia relationship is to see how cooperation has failed and conflict has triumphed. And this idea that cooperation and conflict are either or, they're opposite ends of a spectrum, where cooperation means peace and conflict means war, I want to sort of explode that dichotomy. I think it's very false and misleading for reasons that I'll get into. Cooperation and conflict are not opposite ends of a spectrum. And in the EU-Russia relationship, we see a very complex interplay between cooperation and conflict, such that with actually more intensified cooperation from 2003, we see the dawn of an entirely new conflict. Okay, so I hope to sort of explain that in more detail as we go ahead. But the main point I wish to make here is just there's a false dichotomy between cooperation and conflict in a lot of the analysis. And I think this false dichotomy, unfortunately, influences some rather wrong-headed policy thinking as well. That what is needed now is actually a more effective, more stable, more intense cooperation. And in fact, if that was the case, I think things would get a whole lot worse. And why do I say that? Well, because the problem, and I'll say more about this in the conclusion, the problem in the relationship has not been with cooperation per se, but a particular kind of cooperation, strategic partnership. EU and Russia have been locked in a strategic partnership since 1992, unofficially and officially since 1997. And all the emphasis in this partnership has been on the strategic side. Partnership has not been sought as an end in itself, but as a means to achieve certain preconceived strategic goals. For reasons I'll elaborate on in the main body of this lecture, the most important strategic goals of EU-Russia cooperation have been in the policy field of external security, and this is really what is at the centre of the dispute over Ukraine, but not just Ukraine. And trying to achieve these strategic ends explains the character of Russia's new sphere of influence and why it's been projected into a common exterior that Russia shares with an enlarged European Union. And I just want to give you a little brief history now of the origins of this new intensified cooperative relationship in the shadow of the EU's largest ever enlargement, and almost certainly the largest ever enlargement it will ever undertake, often referred to as the Big Bang enlargement of 2004. Nothing like it had ever been attempted before, and most people agree nothing like it will be attempted in the future. And the reason why, well, there's two reasons really. One is the scale of the expansion. The EU almost doubled in size. It went from 15 to 25, and later 28 members. The last three members were actually officially included in this enlargement, but they didn't actually come on board until a couple of years later, including Croatia. Now, as EU accelerated eastwards, it would come to share over 2,000 kilometres of border with Russia in not just Finland, which had already been part of the European Union, but of course in the Baltic states. The other historical event, which really is unlikely, one would hope, to be repeated, is the wartime disunity in the dispute over the Iraq War. I don't know if people remember this, but the largest ever public demonstration in history happened in Europe in 2003. Millions came to the streets in London. I was there as an observer, purely academic observer, totally impartial, and also in Rome, in Paris. These are the biggest demonstrations, public demonstrations of their kind in history. And they reflect an enormous dispute at the time between what's often, well, because of Donald Rumsfeld, was referred to as old and new Europe, where countries in Europe were lining up either side on whether to support the US-led invasion of Iraq. And the great fear in Brussels is that this division within Europe would be reflected in sort of new dividing lines in the continent, of the kind that hadn't been seen since the end of the Cold War. So these two factors about the EU's enlargement kind of help to explain why the EU sought to fundamentally reform its strategic partnership with Russia from 2003 to 2005. And now, looking from the Russian perspective, 2003 to 2005 is also a key moment, a very formative period in Russia's geostrategy. In 2003, before the Common Spaces talks began, the Common Spaces is the agreement I'm going to be focusing on in a second. Before these talks began, Russia rejected the EU's attempts to include it in the framework of its new neighbourhood policy. Russia said that it did not want to be recognised as just another eastern neighbour of the EU, subject of the EU's external relations. It wants to be recognised as an equal partner. And this is a familiar point of annoyance from the Russian side with not just with the EU, but with relationships with the West more generally in the post-Cold War era, as I'm sure most of you are aware. In 2005, we get President Putin's famous and much misquoted in the West statement on geopolitics. The official quote goes like this: above all, we should acknowledge that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of the century. As for the Russian nation, it became a genuine drama. Tens of millions of our co-citizens and co-patriots found themselves outside of Russian territory. Moreover, the epidemic of disintegration infected Russia itself. Now that's the official Kremlin translation. The unofficial translation comes from the Associated Press, and that's the one that's constantly quoted in the West, not just in the media, but also by politicians. And this translation subs the word catastrophe or disaster, and calls the breakup of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And this mistranslation really ratchets up the drama to this claim. It subtly but importantly changes the entire tenor of what Putin had to say, and so begins the West's misunderstanding of Russia's contemporary geostrategy. Now, I want to talk about the Common Spaces Agreement itself. As I say, many of you will not be familiar with this, but it was signalled as a new beginning in the cooperation between the EU and Russia. Now, it was the product of 2 years of intense diplomacy, and it has been subject to different, actually flatly opposing assessments of its importance. And I'll be quite clear which side of the fence I come down on. Some see this treaty arrangement as a promising new beginning in EU-Russia relations. It was part policy roadmap, part international treaty, as I said, wholly the product of 2 years of very intense diplomacy. The agreement has been seen as evidence that, in quotes, EU-Russia relations have advanced significantly towards increasingly close cooperation, end quote. Its comprehensive terms of association span 4 broad domains of policy cooperation that encompass nearly the whole range of the EU's multifaceted relations with Russia in the 21st century. Others, however, have always been quite sceptical of this. The roadmap, they say, is nothing but a dead end. The agreement that constitutes the common spaces is, and I quite like this one, a triumph of diplomatic borscht. It is full of technocratic jargon and vague promises. The text spools out over 400 bulleted action points, and despite all its specificity, the text is said to be remarkably vague on implementation mechanisms. It lacks overall strategic guidance, policy instruments, or precise definitions of its key terms. This is what the skeptics say, this is what they've always said, and I think they're wrong. And they're wrong because of 2 things. Really, first of all, because the scope of cooperation that was agreed to is totally, goes way beyond anything that had been agreed to before. It goes beyond the legal framework of partnership and cooperation between the EU and Russia, which was agreed to in 1997. It sets out a roadmap for joint action that's since been continued in the follow-up to the Common Space Agreement, which is called the Partnership for Modernisation. It sets a new it does genuinely set a new beginning in the cooperation, what historians might call a turning point in the relationship. And you don't have to just take my word for it, we can listen to the people involved at the time. Both sides, EU and Russia, agreed to the outcome of the Common Spaces negotiations in the spring of 2005. Russian President Vladimir Putin described it as, in quotes, the political zenith in Russia's relations with Europe. His counterpart, the head of the European Commission, Manuel Barroso, was even more pleased. He said the agreement was of world historic significance, a moment of confirmation between the EU and Russia of, in quotes, a common vision for a European continent united in the principles of peace, security and enlightenment. Very grand terms, both of them political zenith and a brand new beginning for Europe, but that sort of captures the kind of elation that perhaps comes after 2 years of stop-start diplomacy. For both parties, this event of consensus transformed their bilateral association. Each was keen to embrace the possibilities of a renewed strategic partnership which promised mutual enrichment and common international action. But one aspect of the agreement, is coming to my second point on the slide, one aspect of the agreement has proved to be both the most strategically significant and the most controversial. Before the Common Space Agreement, the EU and Russia had never seriously considered joint action in security affairs. Prior to 2005, there were only piecemeal arrangements on security cooperation, but this changed in the context of the Common Spaces negotiations, when the international boundaries between these partners and neighbours began to soften. And the defining moment comes in the agreement on the common, it's called the Common Space of External Security. So there are 4 common spaces in total, referring to the 4 policy fields of international cooperation. And the one concerning external affairs, particularly external security, is the one I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of this talk. Agreement in this policy field required the EU's recognition of Russia as a neighbour of a special kind. Unlike the other neighbours on the eve of the EU's major eastern enlargement, Russia was become an equal partner of the European security community. But this special recognition of Russia's position on the edge of Europe brought with it its own special problems. Now, let's sort of now focus on what these are. It's about the new geopolitics of conflict. My claim, and I think it is a bit of a new claim, is that the geopolitical fault line between Russia and the West does not lie between the EU and the United States, or even the EU and NATO, but the EU, not between Russia and the United States, or Russia and NATO, but Russia and the EU, and particularly can be found in the Common Space of External Security. Now, the first thing to say about this fault line is it's not altogether new. There's, my understanding of history is always about continuity and change, and the continuity is with what's often called Russia's Monroe Doctrine, and I'm going to quote the most clear-cut statement of what that is. It comes from 1992, excuse me if I pronounce this name wrong, Yevgeny Ambarsumov. He was the Supreme Soviet Chair on International Affairs, and his statement on the Russian zone of interest beyond its borders is, I think, the clearest articulation to date of Russia's ambitions for external security. This is 1992, this is just the eve of the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. And the quote is, as the internationally recognised legal successor to the USSR, the Russian Federation should base its foreign policy on a doctrine declaring the entire geopolitical space of the former Union to be the sphere of its vital interests, like the United States Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, and should strive to achieve understanding and recognition from the world community of its special interest in this space. Russia should also strive to achieve from the world community recognition of its role as political and military guarantor of stability in the entire former space of the USSR. In that statement about Russia's right and responsibility to protect the post-Soviet space really focuses in on, it certainly does in later iterations, focuses in on the problem of Russian minorities, which of course is what the geopolitical disaster that Putin referred to. The idea being that Russia has both a right and a responsibility to protect Russian minorities in neighbouring countries in the post-Soviet space as an extension of not just a kind of idea of its national interests, but in the same way that that quote just emphasised, because of its, through a recognition from the international community, through a recognition of the rights and responsibilities that Russia has as a Security Council member, and the special UN-approved mandate that for Russian peacekeeping operations that were negotiated at the very end of the Cold War. Now, I don't know if EU policymakers were aware of this statement on Russian zones of interest from 1992, or why it continued to have influence in Russian security policy, but the key point I want to make about the change, so I'm talking the continuity really from the post-Cold War era, the change is that as of 2005, this zone of interest outside of Russia's borders is no longer just a Russian zone. It is a common zone, a common exterior that Russia shares with an enlarged EU. And Russia's more assertive security policy towards its neighbours since 2005, and especially to those neighbours that house significant Russian minorities, can best be understood by studying its geopolitical rivalry with the EU. And I want to be a bit more specific about what that space and what that rivalry refers to. So jumping around a little bit here. Sorry. And it can be seen in the text of the Common Space Agreement. We're referring to the Common Space of External Security. On Russia's insistence during the negotiations of this key strategic aspect of the agreement, the EU's preferred term for this shared common exterior, which is the common neighbourhood, is the EU's preferred term, that was dropped in the official agreement in favour of what is a deeply relativistic formulation, which is, quote, the countries adjacent to Russia and the countries adjacent to the EU. Now this language is tantamount to a confession about the unstable character of the EU and Russia's now reformed strategic partnership. Rather than accept the EU's position that it was possible to achieve a common security strategy towards their shared vicinity, Russia's rejection meant there could be only a very minimal common position could be arrived at. To put a finer point on it, the only common international position that was available after 2005 was the accommodation of two equally legitimate external security policies. So Russia basically welcomed the opportunity for a more comprehensive strategic partnership with the EU, but at the same time it refused to abandon its post-Cold War strategy of having sole responsibility for security along Russia's vulnerable southern and eastern borders. Now, I'll get into more detail about the kind of rivalry as we move on. Now, as promised, another cartoon, just to break up some of the kind of seriousness of this talk. This, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but before the bear was the octopus. Russia used to be seen as an octopus with its an equally menacing animal, albeit one from the sea, and an octopus that extends its tentacles around Eastern Europe, the failing Ottoman Empire, to Finland, into the Caucasus and in Central Asia. Notice that there's not many other animals kind of represented in this chart. There's certainly none that have the same menace as the giant octopus there. But the reason I kind of put up this slide is to just remind you that spheres of influence originates, and this is a cartoon from 1900, originates towards the end of the 19th century, and that's where Russia's initial involvement in spheres of influence is at its most intense. Now, I want to talk about something which came out actually in a class discussion in my global governance class just a couple of days ago, which is the remarkable diplomatic doublespeak that is communicated from Russia, that through kind of diplomacy, a certain confusion, contradictions, second reality is created that just flummoxes everyone. And one of the ways that this has been described in the literature is by Roy Allison, who's a professor of Russian politics at the University of Oxford. He's described Russia's diplomacy over the Western accusations about its involvement in Ukraine as a diplomacy of deniability, where Russia has constantly sought to deny any military intervention in Ukraine. Now, for more than 6 weeks after the Crimean occupation, President Putin explicitly denied that Russian soldiers had been involved. but the ground is constantly shifting here. In April 2014, he suddenly shifted to admit that Russian servicemen did back the Crimean Self-Defense Forces. In Crimea, Russia created conditions, I'm quoting here, with the help of armed forces, with special armed groups and armed forces for the expression of the will of the people living in Crimea and Sevastopol. I'm sure you're all aware of this, some of this rhetoric. In respect to eastern Ukraine, however, blanket denials by Putin that any Russian forces were involved continue to be made. What the quote here is, there are no armed forces, no Russian instructors in southeastern Ukraine, and there never were any. That was replaced only a couple of months later by an admission that Russian mercenaries were taking part in the fighting. So this kind of constant kind of shifting of the goalposts in terms of what Russia's involvement in Ukraine are certainly confuses people in the West, and maybe that's exactly what it's designed to do. Moscow continued to deny that regular forces were involved in the Ukrainian conflict, but the scale of Russian military intervention in August and September of 2014 was such that Russian denials convinced very few in the international community. And I want to suggest, this is kind of Roy Allison's kind of take on the deniable military intervention in Ukraine. And I want to say that something very similar is happening with Russia's denials over spheres of influence. Now, these accusations have been levelled against Russia by the United States, by Merkel's Germany, by NATO, and by the EU. That Russia is engaging in a 19th century mode of power politics by projecting a sphere of influence over its neighbours. Now, Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, when sitting alongside his German counterpart at a news conference in February 2014, tried to turn some of this criticism back onto the EU in particular. He said, "I fully agree with my German colleague," who's sitting beside him, "that there should be no spheres of influence, but in dragging Ukraine to one side, telling it that it needs to choose either or, to either be with the EU or be with Russia, the European Union is in fact trying to create such a sphere of influence. And this is obvious, and no nice words can change that." Russia's problem, as with the denials over intervention, is that nobody agrees with them. It's far from obvious that the EU is pursuing a sphere of influence strategy. Its unconventional interventions in the common space of external security do not make the same kind of aggressive and possessive claims on its neighbours that Russia's interventions do. And in much the same way as the language games on the denial of intervention, Moscow has sought to change the terms of the discussion on its geopolitics away from the idea of spheres of influence and all the kind of negative 19th century connotations that this has, to a more modern and less hostile notion of spheres of interest. There's kind of slight changes all the time in the language. It's very, very interesting. Maybe you don't, but I do. But when the emphasis is placed here with spheres of interest is on the cultural and economic ties that Russia has with its neighbours, and the whole threat of military force, of the influence of military force, is downplayed. As I say, not many people believe these kind of Russian contortions of diplomacy, and I want to suggest that with one of the latest ideas to emerge in Russian foreign policy discourse, we started to see the articulation of a sphere of influence and all that mean. And it's an idea that I'm sure everyone in this room has heard about, the idea of Ruski Mir or the Russian world. There's not actually that many quotes, official quotes about the Russian world. This is one of them, though. In Ukraine, as you may have seen, a threat were our compatriots, this is from President Putin in 2014, our compatriots, the Russian people, and people of other nationalities, their language, history, culture, and legal rights guaranteed, by the way, by European conventions. So it's kind of constantly shifting the territory of discussion. When I speak of Russians and Russian-speaking citizens, I'm referring to those people who consider themselves part of the broad Russian world, the Ruski Mir. They may not necessarily be ethnic Russians, but they consider themselves Russian people. Now, this has to be unpacked because this throws all kinds of ideas out there. And I will try and unpack this in a second. I just want to say that later in 2015, during the kind of annual televised marathon interviews that President Putin engages in, he returned to this issue once again, and he suggested a very broad definition of who the Russian people are. He sought to make it clear his position that the state's rights and responsibilities to secure the lives of Russians meant acknowledging that this identity of the Russian people was primarily a cultural one, and it was open. It was not bounded by a descriptive criteria of birth, like race or ethnicity. It was not bounded by legal criteria of statehood concerning citizenship. Being Russian, and therefore being able to enjoy the protection of the Russian state, was a privilege open to anyone who self-identified as Russian. Now, this is where he sort of elaborates on this. His comments here are very pointedly directed at the government in Kiev. He said, I should say, in 2015, it's also very important that Kiev officials observe the legitimate rights and interests of Russians living in Ukraine and those who consider themselves Russian regardless of what their passports say. People who consider Russian their mother tongue and Russian culture their native culture, these are Russians. People who feel an inextricable bond with Russia, these are Russians. Of course, any country cares about people who treat it as their motherland. Motherland, of course, being Russia. And this is nothing extraordinary, except it is extraordinary. It is totally extraordinary. Because the definition being employed here of Russians, or who Russians are, is partly a very muddled one, and partly a very radical one. Because in this vague definition of Russianness, we get a permissive opportunity, really, for the government in Moscow to defend the security of a very large cultural community with anyone who says they are Russian. And there's really no objective criteria for defining what is Russianness now. It is about a self-identification of being Russian. And this is why the Russian world idea can be considered an idea of Russia's new sphere of influence. Now, while the Kremlin may continue to deny it has a sphere of influence or any interest in projecting force into neighbouring states, all this denial brings, to my mind at least, a famous line from Shakespeare's Hamlet. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. In the extensive round of denials over Russian intervention and the sphere of influence that extends into Ukraine, the Kremlin has actually revealed a great deal about precisely these things. What we've been told of is an expansive idea of Russian identity. This is combined with the existing responsibilities of the office of the president in protecting the lives of Russians as laid down in the Russian constitution. And we get, from this combination, both from the legal kind of basis in the constitutional order of the Russian Federation and this expansive idea of Russian identity, we get an outline of a very radical Russian security policy towards its neighbours. It places the interests of Russian identity above the interests of its neighbours and the wider international community to preserve the security guarantees of territorial sovereignty that underpin the contemporary international order, and especially the institution of the international border. This is why I see the Russian world as an idea of a new sphere of influence, and why I see it also as a fundamental challenge to the statehood of some of Russia's neighbours, and also to the EU's own interests in external security. Now getting on to the part of the talk where I'm really at the kind of edge of my research. This is kind of pushing towards things that I don't know very much about, because it's very contemporary. It's an unfolding picture. This is dealing now just with the period in the last year. And I say it does require more research, but what I'm looking to explore is how this Russian world concept has extended beyond Ukraine to formulating Russia's relationship with Georgia and Moldova, and also, interestingly, Serbia. Of course, where it's kind of a brotherhood, not necessarily based on Russian ethnicity, but a sort of broader understanding of kind of Slavic identity. They also say, I don't have great amount of text to read out of here, so I'm just going to read from the slides. Another aspect that I'm sort of looking at the moment is how a topic of a division has occurred over the last year or so between, certainly in Russian discourse, between the EU's liberal ideas in its neighbourhood and the traditional values that underpin the Russian world. Now, actually this division is not, can be traced back to the Common Spaces Agreement and the terms of the Treaty on Agreement on External Security. Now, you may recall that I said that Russia had rejected the EU's depiction of this common space of external security as a common neighbourhood. Now, the reasons for doing this were not really made all that explicit at the time, but one commentator who was writing at the time, Dr Iain, who's professor at the University of Birmingham, he said that concessions that the EU made to Russia's terms for external security meant that the rest of the language of the Common Spaces Agreement, which is infused with all this talk of shared values between the EU and Russia, and that had really become insignificant at a strategic area, the most strategically important area. But in this most strategically important area, there was a clear divergence opened up, and it's this divergence, this crack in the EU-Russia Common Space Agreement, which has just opened up even more over the last 10 years or so. Dr Iain, in subsequent writings, has suggested that the Russian governing elite, despite its claims to sharing fundamental values with Europe, as it agreed to under the Common Spaces Treaty, since 2005 has engaged more and more in a battle of ideas with the EU to promote and defend the legitimacy of its own norms on competing principles of political organisation, and all as an alternative to the supposedly universal Western liberal democratic norms projected by the EU. As the idea of the Russian world has taken shape, the battle of ideas between the EU and Russia over external security has become much more clear-cut and much more normatively defined. In fact, we can see recently, over the last year or so, how this geopolitical and geostrategic divergence and rivalry has been overlaid with ideas, certainly from the Russian side, of a civilizational discourse. And I find this both alarming and remarkable. Sergei Lavrov has quoted Samuel Huntington's famous thesis about the clash of civilizations. I don't know how many of you are aware of that book, The Clash of Civilizations. It's probably the most famous book in international relations since the end of the Cold War. It might even be more famous than Joseph Nye's book on soft power, on the uses of power, whatever it's called. But you all know that soft power. Well, perhaps most of you have heard of Clash of Civilizations. Well, this is Sergei Lavrov. It's a very incendiary, a very explosive thesis, the Clash of Civilizations. It basically depicts the future of global conflict after the end of the Cold War. Huntington expected the geopolitics of the post-Cold War era to be mapped out in terms of clashes between, I think it was 9 different civilizations mentioned in his book. All of them occupy sort of tectonic-like plates across the world's surface. And the idea here, of course, of kind of referring to this thesis is very provocative. And Sergei Lavrov's argued in 2014, I'm quoting him here, the process of globalization has radically increased the transparency of national borders and contributed towards the destruction of the closed societies in which most of humanity used to live. One form of reaction to this has been the aspiration of peoples to preserve and strengthen their culture and their religious and civilizational identity. If this commitment is not recognised as a legitimate and justified one, there is the risk of heightened international tensions, particularly along the borders of the so-called civilizational blocks, as Samuel Huntington once described them in The Clash of Civilizations. In his worldview, in the Russian worldview, those civilizational blocks cleft Ukraine in two. On one side, we have the Russian civilization of the Russian world, and on the other, we have the EU's common neighbourhood. Now, on the 11th of June 2015, so we're getting really up to within the last year now, the EU's Office of External Relations released the following press release. The title was, "Russia is no longer a strategic partner of the EU." Quite explicit what it contains, and it states that it's results of a European Parliament vote. To quote the press release, it says, "The EU must critically reassess its relations with Russia, which are profoundly damaged by Russia's deliberate violation of democratic principles, fundamental values and international law, with its violent action and destabilisation of its neighbours." Now, this press release quotes the European Parliament's rapporteur who forwarded this motion about the end of the strategic partnership with Russia, and he says, "With its aggression against Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, the Russian leadership has put our relations at a crossroads. It is up to the Kremlin to decide now which way it will go, cooperation or deepened alienation. I am convinced the Russian people, the Russian people, as all of us, want peace, not war. A change in Russia can and will come from within. Meanwhile, we must send a strong message to the Russian leadership that we stand united with the victims of its aggression and those who stand for the values the EU is founded on." The European Parliament passed this resolution, signalling the end of the EU and Russia's strategic partnership by an overwhelming 494 votes to 135, with 69 abstentions. Now, the message that this sends out has not been lost on Russian policymakers. Just 2 days ago, at a conference in Berlin, Russia's previous foreign minister, Igor Ivanov, said the following, previous, of course, before Sergei Lavrov: "We have to recognise the period of Russian-EU relations, which lasted for more than 20 years, has ended. It had its logic, its dynamics, its driving forces and its stakeholders on both sides, but now we have to turn the page and start a new chapter. Neither Russia nor Europe should be held hostage to our common past." I continue to quote him. "Of course, many of us can feel nostalgic about the heydays of cooperation between Moscow and Brussels. Politicians from my generation invested a lot of time and energy in working on the 4 common spaces, cooperation roadmaps, and then the Partnership for Modernisation, and other projects that were never fully implemented. The current reality is not what we had hoped for 20 or even 10 years ago." That's the end of the quote there. Oh, no, it's not actually. There's one more paragraph. "We should not," and this is kind of where I really want to emphasise my agreements with Igor Ivanov. "We should not over-dramatise the current situation. Not all the relationships in this world work out, neither between people nor between nations. Today, the most important and the most urgent thing to do is to learn our lessons from the last 20 years and to set a realistic course for the future." And as I say, I share this sentiment, and in the final part of my talk, I want to reflect on the lessons that can be learned in the last 10 to 20 years of the EU-Russia relationship. Now, there's only got one more animal image to show you, and there's one after this one. Now, this one is from a report by the largest, I think it is the largest think tank in Brussels, the CEPS, the Centre for European Policy Studies. And here you'll notice straight away that Russia is once again depicted in the familiar terms of a bear, although this time the bear knows how to dress. And then on the other side, we have, yet again, an unfamiliar image of the EU. This time the EU is depicted as an elephant, also suited and booted. Now, this elephant is, quite why the EU is depicted as an elephant, I don't know. One hazard to guess, because the elephant's very big, because it's grey and boring though, because it's very big, because it is, it's also because it's seen as a fairly benign animal. This idea that the EU is a major power, and I don't think many would in Brussels would deny that they'd like to see themselves as EU as a major power, but not in the same way that Russia is a major power. The way that EU is often conceived of as a major power is a major power with a much friendlier face. It's a major power that is conceived of as a civil power or a normative power, but certainly not a great power in the way that Russia is conceived of. Great power being a traditional military-based state that can project its force considerably beyond its borders. Now, as I said earlier on in this presentation, I wanted to draw out how these images are not helpful. They're not helpful because they depict a very strong divergence between the EU and Russia. And while there is been a strong divergence in the kind of geopolitical claims that are made, they are geopolitical claims that emanate from exactly the same source, from a common policy commitment. And that is why I'm going to bring my own kind of animal imagery to the discussion. Yes. Now, incredibly cute, and I think, I'm trying to learn Russian at the moment, and I think this is Dva Yoshka. Yes, okay, thank you. Now these two cute hedgehogs are here for a reason. I want to explain why I think hedgehogs offer a better animal metaphor than any of the others that we've looked at so far. Now there's two reasons for why I think it's helpful to talk about the dilemma of the relationship, the dilemma of the strategic partnership in terms of hedgehogs. One, because it emphasises not the differences between the EU and Russia, but their similarities. It is what they share, their common interests and the common space between them, if not necessarily common values, which I think ought to be the focus of attention as we try to work out the problem of the relationship and chart a way forward. But perhaps the more significant reason is that actually the hedgehog dilemma has, as is often referred to, has a long history in philosophy and also in psychology. It speaks to a familiar problem of relationships and not just political ones. For those who here has heard of the hedgehog dilemma? Half a person. Okay, so the hedgehog dilemma is it's also sometimes called the porcupine problem, and it's a metaphor that's used to illustrate the challenges of human intimacy. It was first outlined by the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in 1851, around about the time just before the spheres of influence first emerged. But that's just a coincidence, of course. But he concluded, but the way he depicts it basically is the following. He told a story about two hedgehogs. On a chilly winter day, two hedgehogs decide to huddle together for warmth. But as they move closer, they begin to prick one another with their quills. They immediately move away from one another, only to have the freezing cold air drive them back together again. And again, the painful pricking occurs, and they inch back once more. This idea of being jabbed by each other's quills as they move together, and then they move back and they move together again, is, says Schopenhauer, has a kind of natural conclusion, and the hedgehogs discovered that they would be best off by remaining a little distance from one another. In other words, the hedgehogs realise that while they want to be close for warmth, The only way to avoid hurting one another is to avoid getting too close. And this is the issue facing cooperation between an enlarged EU and Russia. Since 2003 and 2005, they have just been too close for comfort. And this has been discovered through their conflict dynamic over external security, and these are the external quills that have pricked the other party, have upset their arrangements of cooperation, and have ultimately made a comprehensive strategic partnership seem like yesterday's dream. Now, I'm getting very close to the edge, perhaps please here. And in, this is the final slide, and I've got a lot of text, but I'll try and keep my comment brief. In conclusion, I wish to endorse Igor Ivanov's sentiment that the kind of imagination that's required to think afresh about the recent past and the near future of the EU-Russia relationship is one that does not succumb to overly dramatic or even overly pessimistic interpretations. And at the moment there's a lot of these around. As I suggested at the outset of the talk, there's some very passionate opinions, and most of them are pretty despairing and alarmist. Cooperation has failed, conflict has triumphed, and some of the pessimists were right, I think within the core were right all along. And pessimists I'm referring to here are the likes of John Mearsheimer. Now, has anyone heard of John Mearsheimer? I know you're getting your eyes. John Mearsheimer is, right now, is probably the biggest name in international relations. He is a globe-trotting star professor, constantly asked to give talks, particularly in China, where he's very popular. And he's very pleased to be popular in China. He's not so popular in Washington. And one of the reasons he's so popular in China, and he believes he'll be popular in Moscow too, he said this, is because he talks a language of great power politics, and particularly of geopolitics, of the problems of a conflict in the world, the problem of conflict in the world being one that is unavoidable. And a lot of the despair over the current state of the crisis in Russia's relations with the West, and the EU in particular, reflect a kind of a dominance of realism in these interpretations. And this is a quote from a piece in the issue of Foreign Affairs magazine that came out just yesterday. Alexander Motil, some of you might have heard of him too. He's describing the need for a grand strategy on Ukraine that brings together Russia and the EU and recognises that Russian foreign policy has always been shaped by unchanging geopolitical realities. Now, as I have tried to outline in this talk, there is nothing unchanging about Russia's geopolitical position. It's been constantly changing. It's been constantly changing since 2003, and it's still changing, and I'm still trying to keep up with it. And the idea that there are unchanging geopolitical realities, that there's some kind of fixed interest that Russia has with its neighbours, that kind of compels Russia to intervene in the common exterior of the EU. That's just simply not the case. It is a interpretation that is just based on a very pessimistic view of the world. And there's something very dangerous in assuming that any of the geopolitics I've talked about today are fixed, including the geopolitics of the Russian world. Because to sort of suggest that this is a fixed and unchanging geopolitical reality would actually inevitably involve the recognition of the Russian world formally in a treaty as a Russian sphere of influence. Now, that kind of strategic conclusion is not going to solve the conflict or the crisis as it currently manifests itself. So I think this kind of pessimism over geopolitics should be rejected because it would lead to a major strategic miscalculation. My second point is to challenge Mearsheimer. And this definitely needs more thought because Mearsheimer is a big name and we have to be careful when we take on big names. so this is a kind of rethinking aloud here. Mearsheimer's argument in two major publications, one at the very end of the Cold War, one also in Foreign Affairs magazine just a couple of years ago, has, there's a great inconsistency between these two publications. The first one talks about the delusion of cooperation, the idea that cooperation between Russia and the West, as it was kind of first outlined at the end of the Cold War, was doomed to fail. That's the first thing. And the second publication he set out was how, in typically blunt style, he said that the crisis in Ukraine was all the West's fault. And in particular, he was referring to NATO and NATO expansion and enlargement. As I say, I think both of these interpretations are false, and they're false because of their underlying pessimism. There is the suggestion in both cases is that there is a foregone conclusion at work. Conflict was inevitable, cooperation was bound to fail, because the West sought cooperation with Russia. The whole crisis in Ukraine is the West's fault. Now, cooperation quite clearly involves more than one party, and a bilateral cooperation involves two parties. And I want to suggest that you cannot pin the blame on the West, just as you cannot pin the blame on Russia. The problem of cooperation, and the problem of the crisis is a problem of mutual influence, a problem of interdependence, a problem particularly of the idea of strategic partnership. And the kind of final remarks here, as I say, I still have to sort of really think these through, and look forward to your comments and really help me sort of refine my thinking, or reject my thinking altogether. We'll see what you say. But the one of the ways to deal with the darkness, the dark side of cooperation, as I've depicted it here, is to rethink the idea of partnership and move away from the idea of strategic partnership, which has, thankfully, been put to rest quite recently in the EU-Russia relationship. And one idea that I think might be worth talking about more is the idea of a partnership of moderation. It's based not on securing preconceived strategic goals in the relationship, but on encouraging the mutuality and the cooperation in self-restraint. There's not been a lot of self-restraint in strategic partnership, and this is a problem, and I think it's endemic to the very idea of a strategic partnership. And the second point is really to pick up on a recent statement from the EU's foreign policy team, and that is that which they set out a set of 5 new principles to define the renegotiation of EU's relationship with Russia. And one of these, and I think the most important of these, was the principle of selective engagement. And I would suggest that selective engagement is actually not a bad principle to work with. If we go back to the hedgehogs, the idea that 2 hedgehogs may be discovering their safe and respectful distance from one another, and that's the kind of thing, this kind of selective engagement is a much more tentative idea of how to cooperate. It's much less ambitious. There's no far-reaching, comprehensive roadmaps in selective engagement. It is a much more piecemeal, make it up as we go along, we'll muddle through, it'll be okay. And that might not satisfy any strategic thinkers, and that's precisely my point. It shouldn't satisfy strategic thinkers, because one of the great problem in the relationship so far has been an overemphasis on strategic thought. Thank you very much.